and welcome to another episode of Script Apart, a podcast about the first draft secrets of great movies and TV shows. My name's Al Horner, and on today's episode, we're embarking upon a mission that we've been hoping to make happen since the very inception of this show. Yes, joining me today is a true maestro of modern blockbuster filmmaking. He is a writer-director who won a Best Screenplay Oscar before his 30th birthday for the timeless neo-noir The Usual Suspects. After that, he made a thrilling pivot into action cinema, pushing the boundaries of the medium via stunts unlike anything ever attempted before. His glittering 16-year-long partnership with Tom Cruise spans films like Valkyrie, Edge of Tomorrow, and Top Gun Maverick, all of which he co-wrote. But it's his work at the helm of this generation's biggest action franchise as a writer-director for which he's best known. Yes, this week on Script Apart, discussing the astonishing Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, it's the one and only Christopher McQuarrie. The prospect of making a 7th Mission movie, Chris's third in the director's chair, lit a fuse, if you'll excuse the pun, on a number of questions for the filmmaker at the onset of this project. Questions like, how do you take a franchise that has already threatened audiences with nuclear bombs and all sorts of other world-destroying weapons and raise the stakes even higher? Chris's answer was to take his growing anxieties around artificial intelligence and fashion those fears into a high-octane espionage adventure that pulses with timeliness. In the spoiler conversation that you're about to hear, we dig into those anxieties, learning how they resulted in The Entity, the film's mysterious cybernetic threat. You'll also hear how very different the film would have been had it not been for the pandemic, which torpedoed plans for a plot involving the actor Nicholas Hoult playing some kind of phantom. And there's also some discussion about the rationale behind that shocking death at the end of the film's second act, which for the record, I did not see coming. We also get into the film's astonishing climax, a train sequence that acts as a literal cliffhanger, and explore the emotional journey that Ethan Hunt is on in this movie. I should mention that one thing you won't hear much about, unlike in every other episode of Script Apart, is the film's first draft, but there's a good reason for that. As Chris explains, there wasn't one. The circumstances of making this film hot on the heels of 2018's Fallout meant that he and his co-writer Eric Jenderson were kind of making things up on the fly. Writing a Mission Impossible movie, you see, isn't all too different from what it must feel like for Ethan surviving one of these films. There's a lot of improvising out of tight spots and figuring things out as timers tick ominously down, requiring the storytelling equivalent of Tom Cruise driving a motorbike off a Norwegian clifftop into a base jump and landing on a moving train. Maybe a tiny bit safer, but you catch my drift. This is a spoiler conversation if you hadn't already guessed, so if you're yet to see this amazing film, what are you doing? Come on, you know the drill. Get yourself to a cinema and soak in the atmosphere of watching a Mission Impossible movie on the big screen with a packed crowd. Then come back as we dive into every detail, all the twists and turns. A huge thanks to Chris, who I could have spoken to all day about this movie and his career. A big thank you also to our Patreon supporters who help make this show possible. If you're not already a member of that community but would like ad-free episodes, early access to episodes, access to our brand new video bonus segment Postscript, and all sorts of other perks, head to patreon.com/scriptapart. That address again, it's patreon.com/scriptapart. Okay, that's all the admin out of the way. Your mission now, should you choose to accept it, is to sit back and enjoy an hour of incredible insight. This is the fantastic Christopher McQuarrie discussing the first draft secrets of Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Thanks everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Script Apart, hosted by me, Al Horner, produced by Camille Demet. Christopher McQuarrie, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Script Apart. How's it going today?
I'm good, thank you.
Chris, you once described how screenwriting is like pushing a rock up a hill and directing is running downhill with that rock chasing after you. When you're 7 films into a beloved franchise, when so many incredible stunts and great storylines have already been explored in that franchise, when the story you want to tell this time around is an ambitious two-parter, and when there's a global pandemic in the mix, as if things weren't challenging enough, how does that analogy change? Like, it must have felt this time like that rock you were pushing was bigger than ever and possibly also on fire.
Yes, on fire, and there was an avalanche coming down as I was pushing the rock up. That would probably be the the simplest visual analogy.
So the hardest one yet, would you say?
It was definitely, yeah, it was far and away the most challenging. Some of the stunts were far and away the most dangerous. Part two is even crazier, and the other thing to factor into all of the things you were just listing is we periodically had to stop shooting part one to shoot pieces of part two that were weather dependent, actor availability dependent, resource dependent. Lots of complicated reasons why. But that meant that you didn't have the luxury of knowing what part one was while you were shooting critical parts of part two. And we're always trying to avoid committing to certain ideas for as long as humanly possible, because once you commit, it becomes a rule. It becomes something you are then obligated to serve. We're trying at all times to remain as flexible as we possibly can. And with part two, everything we were shooting there were big parts of the movie that we were committing to quite declaratively without really knowing how part one ended. So it was a high wire act like I've never done.
I can imagine. So I referenced the pandemic there. Dead Reckoning Part 1 is, of course, a film that was originally slated to hit screens in July 2020. Then it was slated for November 2021. It finally arrives in 2023 with an incredible timeliness to its story, in part as a result of those delays. Dead Reckoning is a tale about artificial intelligence and the danger that it poses, that arrives at this moment in our society in which, well, that's kind of all we're talking about right now. The questions that this film entertains are the exact same questions that we're having in real life at this present moment. That seems kind of the obvious place to begin here, Chris. I'd love to hear what you make of the way the film dovetails with the kind of quite scary genie in the bottle moment that we're in terms of our relationship with that technology right now. And how that was something, well, you evidently kind of saw coming around the bend, something you anticipated, something you seemingly wrote towards.
It was a conversation we had in 2018. This really goes back to Top Gun Maverick. When I was working on that film, and my first meeting in Top Gun Maverick was in 2011 with Tony Scott when he was supposed to direct the movie, Jerry Bruckheimer and Tom. And I obviously, as somebody who had not worked on the first movie, had nothing really to contribute except that I was a 17-year-old kid watching the original movie. What I could relate in that meeting was the experience I had of watching the first Top Gun. And that movie came out during the Cold War. I grew up in what many people listening to this did not experience and will find hard to believe. We grew up under the threat of global nuclear war all the time. That was, we believed, a very real threat, and we were constantly being reminded of that. Which meant that when you went to see a movie like The Hunt for Red October or Top Gun, the Cold War was something you brought to the movie. It was an anxiety that came with you and did not need to be contextualized. You understood in a head-to-head with some foreign power with a red star on it, as you were, or with the Russians in Hunt for Red October. You understood instinctively what the global stakes were and didn't need somebody talking about that because it was all very real world. Making Top Gun Maverick, those stakes didn't exist. It was a very different set of circumstances. And how could you invest the audience? What anxiety was the audience bringing to the movie that you could incorporate into the story? That was a new way of thinking for me in 2011. And now it's an essential component of my storytelling. I'm looking at it and asking myself, what is the audience feeling? What do they bring that removes the burden of having to set those things up, but also invest them in a story in a way they may not be consciously aware of. And so when it came time to start writing this movie, and we were talking about what the global threat was, um, I said to Tom, it's the notion of information technology, of algorithms and algorithm directed information was probably an intellectual idea 2 or 3 years prior. It was now something that you could feel in the zeitgeist was permeating people's lives, and it was a thing people were aware of. They were starting to become aware of the fact that that how they were receiving information and how they were interacting with the world was being affected by automated technology. Uh, and so I said to Tom, "This is what they're bringing to the movie, and it's increasing at this rapidly exponential rate. So as we get closer to releasing this movie, it will only become more understandable. Unlike the Cold War, which when I tried to show my kids The Hunt for Red October, they were kind of tuned out. They were a little bit bored, and I realized it was because the stakes of that movie, I couldn't understand it. I thought this movie really, I will still love the movie. The stakes of the movie were not readily identifiable. You just didn't feel a kid growing up now just didn't feel the threat like they do. So that was really it. It was the application of something that I knew was the source of some social anxiety, and as time went on would only be more so. So had the pandemic not happened, had we finished sooner, um, it it may not have dovetailed uh, as I'm looking for a word. It's yeah, pointedly. I don't want to say conveniently because it's not.
Yeah.
Uh, that sounds a little bit too. I'm. It's seeing it accelerate the way that it is, and the and the rationale with which it is being employed is, at least for me, terrifying. I have to imagine there are other people in the audience who share that anxiety.
Well, what's so interesting, I think, to me is the nuance of it all. Like, we've been watching fables about AI on screen for decades. Space Odyssey was 68, Terminator was 84. Dead Reckoning, though, there are specificities to it that feel very in step with the current conversations around AI. You don't seem to be painting in broad strokes. This seems to be a film that wants to reflect the current anxieties around the technology. It feels like Dead Reckoning has been paying attention to a lot of the stories that have been emerging over the last few years about AI. Can you talk to me about that, about the research that must have gone into informing the entity?
Those were very early conversations that Eric Jenderson and I had, um, along with the means by which to demonstrate it. The whole purpose of the Sevastopol, the opening scene of the movie, is to show a microcosmic notion of what this thing could do, so that you could project it onto a grand scale. Um, the crew of that submarine are simply they're obeying their instruments. When you're in a submarine, there are no windows. There's no spatial awareness beyond your instrumentation. It's sort of the perfect uh, it's the perfect encapsulation of how a of how the misinterpretation of information could lead to your own destruction. Um, that's really why the Sevastopol was in the story. Um, we didn't really anticipate part two uh, becoming relying so integrally on that story. So that last shot that you see in part one was not the was not it was not the opening idea. Usually I start with an ending. It was an organic result of once we decided the insistence that we had on including this scene where a movie opens. It's the first Mission Impossible that opens not on Ethan Hunt, and it was a very unusual departure, and it was one Tom and I really debated. But we recognized the importance of it is that what you're essentially doing, you feel like you're meeting this crew of the submarine, and what is this whole thing about? You're actually meeting the villain of the movie. You're meeting the antagonist before you meet the protagonist, and that was our rationale. Is we're introducing the entity, even though you might not know what it is at that point, before introducing Ethan. I've sort of gotten off task, but that idea, the very early on, Eric and I started extrapolating on and talking about the notions of what this thing could be, and but to be really clear, the entity didn't exist as the entity when the story began. In fact, neither did Gabriel. Nick Holt was originally cast as the villain in our film because Tom had really liked Nick Holt when he auditioned for Top Gun Maverick. He's a very talented actor. He didn't think he was right for that movie, but he recognized that he was a supremely talented actor. And so we cast Nick based solely on that, not really knowing where our story was going. It would have been a very different movie if the pandemic had not taken Nick out of the running. We replaced Nick with Esai Morales, who I had seen on Ozark. Thought he was a really great villain. That opened up a world of possibility about Ethan's past because Esai and Tom are about the same age, started their careers at the same time. And in fact, they met at the very beginning of their respective careers on the set of Bad Boys, where Esai was shooting a movie with Sean Penn, who was Tom's best friend at the time. And that opened up a door into this story that we still didn't understand what it was. And was Gabriel in control of this thing? What did Gabriel represent? And we were shooting the exteriors in Venice before we shot the interiors in Venice. And while we were there, Tom kept saying, I just feel this other presence in the story. I feel that Gabriel is part of something, that he's not the main villain, that there is something behind Gabriel. And I don't know what it is. And he kept referring to this phantom. And he just felt like we needed this other presence. And so we introduced a phantom. We had a guy in Venice dressed in this outfit. He cut a wicked silhouette. And throughout the foot chase in Venice, you kept seeing him. And it was at the party, you kept seeing him in the crowd. And there was a whole other story idea that never came into it about someone from Ethan's past that had been there, had known Ethan before he was Ethan. And the loose idea was that this phantom and that person were the same guy. It was somebody who had sort of been there and been part of Ethan's backstory. All kinds of things that we played with. There are different versions of it that never materialized. But the presence of the entity was there. We just didn't know what it was. And you feel that in the story, that Ethan is moving through this story, following the lead in pursuit of this key, and acutely aware that there is some other force behind it all, but doesn't know what it is. Well, that's because we didn't. And the entity really didn't take shape until it came time to write the scene with, in what we call the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, Harry Elwes' character. When it got down to it, it's like, okay, now we got to describe this thing. And that became the scene that Eric and I wrote that really became then the definition or the defining features of the entity. And we were talking about artificial intelligence, but we were trying not to call it that AI is part of it. You hear them talk about it, this thing, whatever it was, infiltrated Saudi Arabia's intelligence directorate and assimilated their active learning AI before vanishing into the cloud. There's a narrative happening in the DNI about the birth of this thing, or at least their awareness of it. Where it comes from, we know, and we began to hint at that on the train with Carrie Elwes. But in part two, you'll go deeper. You'll learn, and that's the patience required in part one. I've heard a couple of things of, the villain has no backstory. He absolutely has a backstory, and so does Ethan. And where did the AI come from, and where did Gabriel and the AI come together? That's the deeper we dig into the story, that'll all be revealed.
So once you locked in on the entity as your villain, Chris, and once you committed to the idea of AI as a topic, did you build Ethan's emotional journey in the film out from there? Because, well, there seems to be something really interesting happening thematically in the film. AI is inherently cold. It's inherently ruthless. It's driven by like achieving its objective and nothing else. In stark contrast to that, Ethan in this movie seems driven by friendship and by human connection more so than ever. He and Benji both have lines about the importance of the friendships at the heart of the IMF. I think Ethan at one point promises Grace that when you're part of his team, your life is more important than his. Rather than seeing his team as expendable helpers in achieving his objective, like an AI would, Ethan's greatest fear seems to be losing these people. And it becomes, to quote a phrase I've heard you use before, the emotional drag of the movie. What we end up with is this beautiful duality in Dead Reckoning Part 1, compassion and friendship versus calculated efficiency, humanity versus cold, emotionless thinking. Can you talk to me about what's going on there? I seem to be detecting something in Ethan's journey in this film that's built in contrast to the AI theme, the AI topic.
You're so close to it. I don't know how much I want to give the answer away, because I don't want to spoil the fun of it. But yes, it's definitely an emotional. There's definitely an emotional component to that, and an emotional coldness to what the entity is. Its greatest strength is that it does not have Ethan's greatest weakness. And what we defined in Fallout as, when Alec Baldwin says to him, "You see that as your greatest strength. I see it as you see it as your as a weakness. I see it as your greatest strength." Ethan cannot choose between the one life and millions. That was just articulating something that had always been there. That the tension of the movies is not the global stakes; it's the global stakes versus the personal stakes. That everything Ethan must do in order to fulfill his duty comes at the potential expense of those people closest to him. In any big action movie like this, the contract you sign with the audience in the first 10 minutes of the movie is it's all going to turn out okay. What you can't, the secret of making the movies engaging is you can't imagine how it's all going to turn out okay. And you don't know at what cost it will turn out okay. Which obviously in this movie we took further and deeper, and in a way that we knew the audience would feel. The audience would feel in a deep and resonant way. That's the tension that you're feeling in the story. Is Ethan is pitted against something that thinks that thinks in ways that Ethan can think, and that and also does not, and is not burdened by any emotion whatsoever. And you hear Gabriel. It's great you use the word objective. You hear Gabriel talking about Ethan's objective. He doesn't care. He doesn't care about who lives or dies. He only cares about his objective. He's telling Grace about Ethan, but he's really speaking more accurately about the entity. He's a liar. He's somebody who does not care about the truth. And what he's doing in that scene is he's creating doubt. He's creating instability within that relationship. That's really, to me, what's so terrifying about something like The Entity is that it has the potential to Gabriel's whole speech um, in the uh, in the nightclub, manipulating the minds of billions and parsing every cause and effect, however implausible, into creating a very real map of the most probable next. That's Eric Jenderson's line, most probable next. I thought was just like it was brilliant. Um, this idea that it can essentially, by manipulating all of us, determine or or it can determine the outcome. It can ultimately create the outcome it desires. There's another character in Mission Impossible who does that all the time, and so it really in The Entity we found his ultimate adversary. Another Eric Jenderson line: an enemy that is everywhere and nowhere and has no center. You can't kill it, and it's smarter than you, and it's better at it than you are, and it isn't burdened by emotional drag.
If I can just go back to something you mentioned a moment ago, Chris, um, you said that this film would have been very different had the pandemic not happened.
Yes.
Well, let's get down to the big script apart question, which is how different your first draft was. Like, I know in previous mission films, the complexity of these plots and some of the kind of practical challenges of making a movie like this, you're writing on the fly and you're writing and rewriting as you shoot.
Yes.
Was that the case with Dead Reckoning? Talk me through the changes from your initial draft of this film to the fantastic finished movie that audiences are about to see.
So the most terrifying thing that I will share with your listeners, assuming everybody out there is a writer, there was no first draft. When it came time to make this movie, and this was before the pandemic, when the first conversation occurred to make these two movies, I'll go back to the very beginning. The reason why it's a two-part installment, Fallout was 2 hours and 20 minutes long. And it was 2 hours and 20 minutes long because I refused to compromise on the emotion of the story. Which takes us back to Rogue Nation, where the scene in the train station between Ilsa and Ethan in that movie, we thought that was all exposition. And when we saw it put together, we found it was actually genuinely emotional, which we weren't really counting on in a spy movie. And so I wanted to exploit that further in Fallout. And that became the story of Ethan and Julia, because Tom wanted to tie up that story. He was still being asked about Julia, even though he had this growing relationship with Ilsa. How can you be with Ilsa? You're still married to Julia. So we decided to tie up that story. And the impetus of Fallout was the 5 scenes involving the Ethan and Julia story. Those were they were basically the pillars upon which the movie was hung. And the story was 2 hours and 20 minutes long, and it was a struggle to get it down to that. So I knew if I wanted to expand the cast and deepen the emotions, the movie was going to be longer than 220. In fact, it was probably going to be much longer than 220. So I said to Tom, why are we even fighting this? Let's just make it a 4-hour movie. Foolishly. I said, let's make it a 4-hour movie and cut it in half. Let's give ourselves the room. And of course, Mission has a mind of its own, and it expands to fill a vacuum. And then it became a massive struggle just to get part 1 down to 243. And there was no cutting it in half because there was no way to end the movie effectively without it. And there's definitely no way to end it where it didn't end on a cliffhanger, which we found to be kind of a cheap shot. The movie had to be, it felt like it was forcing you to go see the next movie, as opposed to, I dare you to skip the next movie. That was really the feeling we were striving for. So the first conversation I had with Tom was, I'm going to go off and do another movie. I had another little movie I wanted to do. And I said, I just need a break from this. I'm going to go off and do this other little movie, but I'll be back. And then we'll do a 2-parter, this big 2-part installment. And then comes the calendar. You bring out the production calendar, the release of Top Gun Maverick, and a million other factors, none of which were aware of a pandemic coming. And we realized that the timeline would have been such that to do 2 movies the way you normally would, if I went off and did another movie and other planets aligned, all these other plans and things that were supposed to happen, mission was years away. There was no postponing it for just a year. It would have been postponed for a very long time. And the studio was very, very keen on doing another mission on the heels of Fallout and its success. We didn't want there to be 4 years or 5 years between these movies. So I said, okay, so what's the release date? They gave me these release dates. I very quickly did the math and said, if you want to hit that date, I have to start scouting tomorrow. I don't even know what the story is. Doesn't matter. I need to know where we're shooting the movie, because then that's going to tell me what the action is, and the story will come later. So we committed to the notion of 2 movies and the notion of scouting those 2 movies without any concept of what the screenplay was going to be, though this idea of information technology as the villain in some form was already brewing. That's about all I had. Um, then uh, then we were still working on Top Gun Maverick. So imagine I'm prepping a movie with no screenplay, and we are constantly in post-production on Top Gun Maverick, which was a movie that we were still really struggling with certain elements of that story and making them work. Uh, and then of course we were committed. So now we had a start date for Mission Impossible of February 2020 in Venice, Italy. And Top Gun Maverick was not finished. We were still struggling with the score. We were struggling with the mix. We were struggling with a little bit of an edit in the middle of the movie. Hadn't quite nailed it. And Tom and I had all this anxiety because our focus was being pulled more and more away from Top Gun and pushed more and more into Mission Impossible. And I built a set on the roof of the Gritty Palace Hotel in Venice because it afforded me the most spectacular view of Venice. And I did not know what was supposed to happen on that set. I knew, and that was now the first day of shooting in February of 2020. The second day, through the next week and a half, was the foot chase through Venice, which of course I knew exactly what that was. Point to camera at Tom Cruise and he runs. And there wouldn't be any plot, there wouldn't be any exposition, there would be a lot of urgency and pressure, and then there would be this fight on the Midditch Bridge, which we had planned. The action is never the hard part, it's the reasons. Reasons are hard. And reasons are usually done in cars, phone booths, restaurants, hotel rooms, places that you can rebuild and reshoot. I now had reasons on a deck on top of the Gritty Palace Hotel, and I had to hit a bullet with a bullet, and I did not know who was even in that scene. And the pressure to come up with that scene was enormous. And I was under enormous, enormous strain. And Tom had not even arrived in Venice yet. He was a couple days away from arriving, and there was this weird virus. There was people were having symptoms. When we got off the plane in Rome, there was a guy at the airport with a heat gun taking people's temperature. My wife was carrying our dog, and the heat gun, the combined heat of my dog and my wife created white on the heat gun, and she almost got quarantined. And we suddenly realized, this is what's going on. There's like something strange happening. And 2 days before we were due to start shooting, they evacuated the city, and Venice was ground zero in Europe for the pandemic. We were there. We were there as it was happening, and we were 2 days away from shooting, and the movie was shut down. So I was sitting in the Gritty Palace Hotel in Venice. I went down for breakfast, and I was writing. And at 5:00 in the afternoon, I realized in my focus that, with the exception of my wife, no one had come into the restaurant, and that it had been my office all day. Eddie Hamilton, who was in Venice, I called him and I said, meet me in Tom's room, because Tom had this big suite upstairs at the top of the Gritty Palace, which he never made it to. And and Eddie had set up an editing room in the in the living room of this. That's why we had the suite, is because there was an editing room there as well. And we went back to work on Top Gun Maverick while the city was being evacuated. And everything turned upside down immediately. The world changed overnight. Tom, to his credit, was extremely, extremely prescient. And there was still talk that this first thing we did is everybody left for Rome, thinking, oh, it's in Venice, we'll go to Rome. We got to Rome, and Rome immediately said, you got to go. And we had to go back to the United Kingdom. And it became very clear that this thing was rapidly changing the way we live, but it was going to be a couple weeks, or it was going to be a couple of months. And Tom said, no, this is bigger. And he could see it in the Zoom calls that we were having, because now you were no longer in people's presence. He said, this is going to change the industry. And you can already see how no one can predict the future. And without future, people will spin out. They're caved in. They don't know what to do. We have to create future. We have to keep everybody working, and we have to keep the movie going no matter what, no matter at what pace. We just have to keep everybody working. And we had 1 hour Zoom calls every single day. We brought all the departments together, and everybody started analyzing and breaking down the movie and all the things we'd been preparing. And Eric and I were still trying. That's when the real writing of the screenplay began. So we had, it was very backwards. And as a result, the script was coming together piecemeal based on where we would be shooting and what resources we had, and there was no plan. And you remember the pandemic. Any plan you made at 9 a.m. was not the plan at 4 p.m. So how do you write a screenplay in that environment? And how do you write a screenplay when they're already building a train? And when they're trying to figure out where in the world that train is going to go? And how do you test the train? How do you even build the train? Because people can't be in the same place together. And Tom really dove in with both feet, and he said, we're going to create protocols by which we can continue to work. And we brought in medical experts, and we started to develop for ourselves the standards by which a movie could function. And those standards eventually started to radiate outward into the industry. You were literally on the edge of, and you saw streaming that was coming at the same time. You saw the industry on the verge of collapse. You saw an opportunity for movie theaters to simply vanish and streaming to replace them. And Tom bet the other way. The whole industry was leaning towards this way of going. And he said, I don't believe it. He said, people love movies and they love going to the movies, and I love the movies, and we're in. And I said, yeah. I said, we're all in, no problem. And we put everything on the big screen experience, with everybody telling us we were insane. So that's kind of the environment under which we were writing the screenplay. So anything you did to put something on paper and commit to it, you were committing to a fantasy. You couldn't be sure that it would go that way. So everything had to come together based on, are we coming back to Venice? Are we going to be in Rome? Are we going to be in Norway? Is the train even something we should be building? Everything was trepidatious, but you had to keep moving things forward. So I've never sat down and read the screenplay from beginning to end. It never existed in that form until the movie was finished.
That's crazy to hear, because, well, there is such a tightness to the screenplay, Chris. Like, there are so many tiny details that thematically just sing. I've only seen the film once, and I'm sure when I see it a second time and a third time, as I inevitably will, other things are gonna leap out at me. But one tiny detail that did on first watch was, well, from a story perspective, when we first meet Ethan in the film, he's meeting a very nervous new IMF agent who's posing as a food delivery guy. It begins the film on a note of like mentorship almost that kind of carries on through the movie. Like later we'll see Ethan extend that same mentorship towards Grace in the film as he kind of seemingly begins to welcome her into a life in the IMF. it all adds up to this sense of like a baton being passed down, a new generation being ushered in, and perhaps like a new role for Ethan to think about. How do you begin to tie all this in?
Isn't it genius how that scene? Well, here's why it's genius. It was the last day of shooting.
Oh, really?
About 2 months ago. We had a whole other opening for Ethan. We had a whole other story involving the character of Marie and a completely different idea and a different structure for the first act. And we struggled with it mightily. And we went down a logic hole in terms of how to tell all those stories. And I solved the problem by re-editing the first act. But in so doing, Tom has very, very, very few and very specific rules about Mission Impossible. Ethan must receive a mission. There must be the theme song. There must be a mass gag. Those are like the three things. And then anything else you want to do, build a train, throw it off a cliff, have at it. These are the tropes that make Mission. It's what the audience expects. It's what they've showed up for. As Eddie Hamilton says, you're getting your money's worth. And I'm always frustrated by two of those three things. The mass gag to me is just this insane implausibility. And receiving the mission is always an exposition dump, or I'm trying to get away from exposition. And it's literally like going to your annual checkup for me. I'm just like, sooner or later, I'm pushed into the inevitability of having to do the exposition scene. So I had tried other ways to creatively sort of fold that exposition into other things. Him traveling through the desert and the exposition was happening over it, and no one's listening. They're just not paying attention. You can't escape it. Don't fight it. That's the rules. There are very few rules, and the ones that you didn't write, you just got to stick with them. So when I restructured the first act, the whole idea of this other scene ultimately resulted in Ethan being handed a mission. But when I restructured the first act, that it was not in the same order anymore, which meant I had to do another scene where Ethan got the mission, which meant the scene that I had done no longer needed to be in the movie. And it was a scene we had shot twice to try to get it just right. And I called Tom and I said, and the movie was long, and we loved this scene, and the performance in it is sensational. And I called Tom and I just said, it's got to go. It can go, so it must. This scene obviates it. And Tom loved this other scene. And without blinking, he said, you're right, story's king. It's got to go. And I could tell it was painful because he loved the scene. And that necessitated the India Zulu 254, this kid bringing him the mission. And I don't know if you noticed in the credits, the kid's name is Alex James Phelps. His literally has the name James Phelps in his name, which I got an enormous kick out of. And I hired him for very specific reasons based essentially on his look and a reading of some other pages that weren't in our script. And I called him on Zoom and I said, I had seen him read, liked his look, said hello to him. We talked for about 2 minutes. And I said, where are you? And he said, I'm in the UK. I live here. And I said, great. This is going to be the easiest audition you ever had. What are you doing next Friday? He blinked. He said, what? I said, you're in the movie. What are you doing next Friday? He said, nothing. I'm there. Hey, wow, great. And I said, good. You're going to be in a scene with Tom Cruise. The best thing for you to prepare is to not prepare. You're in a scene where you're essentially a food delivery guy. I hadn't figured out food delivery yet, as a matter of fact. I said, you're some sort of delivery guy. You're going to bring him a message. We're going to make up the dialogue on the day. I've got a pretty good idea of what it is. Just don't prepare. Just come in prepared to learn a lot about making movies. And he said, great. And then, and I had him come to the set, which was built between that conversation and our shooting the scene. Gary Freeman repurposed one of our other sets, rebuilt it. And so when you watch the movie now, if you look at the Venice safe house and the room where the mask machine breaks, we just took out the wall that separated them and put a big furnace in that room. And that's where Ethan is at the beginning of the movie. They're all shot on the same set. It's just lit differently. And that kid showed up, and we basically walked through the rationale of the scene. And the notion of him carrying food delivery is I wanted somebody working for the gig economy. I wanted something that involved information technology and this notion of how this generation understands you don't go out to eat, you just make a call and it comes to you. And so they literally bring him his mission like Deliveroo. And I can go much deeper into that scene, but that's how it organically arose.
I suppose I should ask about Grace, the new addition to the franchise. Who was that character to you, Chris? Like, why did the story call for her? And how did she change as Dead Reckoning Part 1 went through its kind of process of evolution?
It's in a word, Haley Atwell. I saw Haley perform on stage here in London. She was in The Pride, and up until that point, I had only seen Haley as a much lauded and always underused supporting character in period dramas. She was always in some sort of a bodice and some sort of a big high wig, um, and I saw her in The Pride and realized there was this completely different dimension to her. Haley also has this innate. She has it, and the way I define it for someone like Haley is I don't know who she is, I don't know what she wants, but I want her to have it. She also has this absolutely phenomenal smile, and that's not something that people do in Mission Impossible. They might grin, but it's not a very smiley movie. And I told Haley very early on, I said, you have this absolutely electrifying smile. We have to find ways to get it in the story. We have to find when when you smile, it's the sort of thing like anybody looking at you, you look at Haley's smile and think, I want somebody to smile at me like that. That was pretty much was Haley's it. However, that's one component. I had read Haley for Jack Reacher, and she wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. She was not right for that role. And had I cast her in that role, I would not have utilized her correctly. She would have been, she would have just been miscast and underused. I then started writing Rogue Nation for Haley, simply because I knew I went to marketing for that movie and said, tell me how to make a Mission Impossible. And I knew they would struggle with marketing Haley because of the way they were looking at the movie. And I didn't want to get into conflict with marketing. I didn't want to be struggling to sell the movie. So I was like, just tell me what you need. And I went for what they wanted, didn't find it, and then found Rebecca Ferguson. And so I ended up going in a completely different direction, which resulted in Ilsa. By the time it came to do this movie, I knew it was time to bring in someone new, and I was ready to serve Haley. My process had developed in such a way that I was really ready to service her unique talent, and that's really how we ended up. That's the short version of how we ended up where we are. A lot of what you're seeing is just me getting out of Haley's way. She gives you thousands of options, incredible subtlety, enormous emotional vulnerability without ever being weak. She's incredibly complex. I encourage anyone, once you've watched the movie, to watch it again and just watch it with the sound off and watch her expressions. She is human anime. She's just so remarkably expressive, constantly active, and she goes through so many different emotions in the story and manages why I thought she was most important in the story. She screws the team over time and time and time again, and the audience never gets tired of it. What was amazing is there was one more betrayal. In going into the train, originally, they offer her the choice. She agrees, she gets the mask on, and then betrays the team and leaves them. The audience was perfectly fine with it. They were frustrated with the team for letting it happen. It actually was hurting the team, not Haley. The point is, Haley could just betray you all day long, and the audience just ate it up. They were like, but it's Haley. She's nice. She means well. They embraced it every time. So we reshot that scene to where she said, "Promise me you'll be on that train," and the mask machine broke. That's why that happened.
Well, I love the mischief of the character. I love the defiance of the character. And yeah, I love what she brings out of Ethan. So yeah, in Grace, we have this great new character entering the franchise. But in Dead Reckoning Part 1, we also have another beloved character who makes her exit. We should talk about Ilsa. The death in this film, her death in this film is shocking. An interesting piece of context around the death of Ilsa in this movie is that years ago, when you were working on Ghost Protocol, before you'd been kind of fully handed the keys to the Mission franchise, you were given a draft of the script in which the character Julia died. And you've described how it really jarred for you, so you rewrote the movie to protect the character. You kind of found a way to keep her alive, and you obviously benefited from that decision in Fallout. You were able to fold that character into that movie. I bring this story up because, well, it suggests to me that kind of killing a female character to advance Ethan's plot isn't something that you necessarily want to do unless the story absolutely demands it. Would that be fair to say?
It's quite the opposite. I wouldn't have a problem with Julia's character dying. My problem with Julia's character dying was she died between movies, and she was written out of the movie after a movie that was dedicated to saving her character. The only comparison I have for that, which I've made before, is Newt, Alien 3, yeah. That the movie starts with, that is disposing of a character. That is not resolving a character or a character arc. It's quite literally, I want to make my movie now, and that's an inconvenience. And it was just brushing her aside, and so when I watched that, I thought, when I read that version of the script, I thought, no matter how this movie ends, it can't end at 100%. It'll always be, she died and you failed to save her. And it's this tragedy that forever this character carries around, but it's done in the most convenient way. And nothing can be that easy. I folded her into the story and made her this burden that two characters were carrying. And Brant's story had nothing to do with Julia. It had to do with the death of these other two people that you never saw. It was all exposition that happened off camera. It wasn't emotion in the movie. It was information, not emotion. When it came time to do this movie, we had talked a lot about that relationship between Ethan and Ilsa. And I know there's a whole cadre of people on social media who love that relationship and want to see that relationship reach this what culmination you want. This is not a world in which people ride off happily into the sunset. That's the whole point of the Julia story. That story happened. We see in the story of Julia what becomes of a happy ending. Ethan Hunt will forever be Ethan Hunt. That is his burden. That is his curse. And the notion that materialized very late in the story was Henry Czerny articulating, the closer someone gets to you, the harder it is to keep them alive. That's like Alec Baldwin's character observing the one life versus the millions. That notion will resonate. It will continue to resonate. And it's a crystalline understanding of what we were after. And every time we looked at Ilsa as a love interest, it diminished her as a character. It emphasized her femininity and and the purpose of her femininity in a way we felt was objectifying. She is as much a member of the team as Luther or Benji, and is not defined by her gender. She's defined by both her skills as an agent, her particularity as an outsider, not really a member of the IMF. her affinity for Ethan, her closeness to him that is forged in something that is not sexual or physical. It's spiritual. They are really they are two characters who are in many ways very similar and in many ways vastly different. Ilsa's an assassin and Ethan is zero body count. They're very, very different characters, and they're in some other world they would be compatible, but they have duties and responsibilities that will forever keep them apart. That made that very difficult decision that much more on story. It didn't make the decision easy, but it sort of made that decision one that felt on story, and it was hard. It was hard, and we leaned into that. We did not shy away from it. And we couldn't allow ourselves we don't look at things in terms of, oh, you can't do that. The thing is that we look at things and say, should we? And could we? And if we did, what would it mean? What would the result be? And that created the shape suddenly of Marie as something that became very necessary in terms of establishing Ethan's distant past, and Ilsa defined his present, and then Grace determines the future, and it's a very interesting one.
It certainly is. Chris, I know we're running out of time, so let me ask you just two final questions before I let you go. I could spend all day breaking down the anatomy of the train sequence, which kind of brings the film to a close. It's so thrilling, even by mission standards, such a spectacle. And I think it lends the film, which is a part one of two, it lends the film a kind of self-contained feeling. Like, it doesn't feel like you're watching a film and then all of a sudden you're being interrupted. So you better come back for part two in order to feel satisfied by the story being told. You know, it's such a climax. It's such a spectacle that, you feel like you're getting more than your money's worth. This is a self-contained movie. How did you approach that scene? And how much were you guided by that sense that you really do get watching the movie, that here is a film with its own beginning, middle, and end. The second film is a part two, and that's going to have its own beginning, middle, and end too.
That kept Tom awake at night.
Oh, really?
It kept him awake at night. He always kept coming to me and saying, and what I knew, the movie started with Tom wanted to jump a bike off a cliff. I wanted to wreck a train. We didn't even start with emotions this time. Like with Julia, it was all about emotion. It was like the emotion will come. What's the big stuff you want to do? And I said, screw it. I want to wreck a train. Buster Keaton wrecked a train. We're always looking at the general. John Frankenheimer's The Train is one of my favorite movies I've ever seen. And truly, if you've never seen it, an astonishing accomplishment for its time. David Lean wrecks a train in just about everything. He wrecks trains getting out of bed. And I thought, I want to wreck a train. That'd be really cool. The problem with wrecking a train is, once you wreck it, it's over. It happens very quickly. So how do you wreck a train and sustain the train wreck? How do you keep the train? How do you make this train wreck happen almost in slow motion without using slow motion? That became the challenge. The punctuation on all of that, the movie had to end, and it had to end in a satisfying way so that it felt like a self-contained film. You looked forward to it continuing, but you didn't feel betrayed. And that's what he just said, they got to leave satisfied. We walked away from Top Gun saying, what do we want the audience to feel? And how do you reconcile these two rules of, it is a part one, it will end on a cliffhanger, and yet it must be satisfying in and of itself. Those were irreconcilable ideas. And quite literally, the movie ends with a train hanging on a cliff. And yet, quite literally, the movie ends with an emotional resolution. We really didn't know what that was. What I did know, when we first came back to the stage from shooting abroad, the very first thing we shot was the interior train stuff. But we only had 2 train cars on set. Only 2 fit on the stage, but we had 4 basic train configurations. So you had to pick which ones you were going to start with. And then it took a week to redress everything so you could go from white to blue to red, all that stuff. White to blue to red and the sleeper car, all the things. We had a red car, and I believe we had the white car on the set, the dining car and the first class seating compartment. And I brought the entire cast together into the red car. And knowing what the configuration of the train was, and knowing what how what cars were in what order because of how they went over the cliff, and also what could happen. Applying all of that in a Venn diagram, we were in the red car, and I said, I don't know how the movie ends, but I know that it ends here. It absolutely will end here. And it was very prophetic because virtually every single one of the last days of principal photography we had, and we had many, where that was the last day and then we shut down. It was the last day and then we were delayed, and then it was the last day before. We were always in the red car. We were always down to the very last day of shooting with Haley assembling the key. That was the last insert of the movie, and it was in the red car. The movie quite literally ended in the red car. The conversation between Tom and Haley, what that was going to be, what that resolution was, we obsessed about constantly and always worried, was it enough? Was it satisfying? And we were relieved in our first test screening when we still had miles to go, when Haley says, I choose to accept, in a movie with no music in the third act and way too long. The audience cheered, and we knew, all right, we're going to be okay. It's going to work. We still got work to do, but that's there. And if you got that kind of reaction, you got a yes out of them. And there are other things happening because you feel Palm's character. You think one thing is happening, and that's a resolution. And then Tarzan comes in and finds her in the chair. And then suddenly what's happening, what you're feeling in the movie, is that the movie is ending, and it ends in a satisfying way. And part two is actually starting. So you're not ending with an ending, you're ending with a beginning. And that's a very different sensation. That really is the code that made the part one, part two work. That's not something we just knew instinctively. It's something we exhaustively studied until we felt it, until we knew an audience felt it.
Well, it's such a great ending to the film, Chris. We began this conversation with a quote of yours. Screenwriting is like pushing a rock up a hill, and directing is like running downhill with that rock chasing after you. Can I end things by asking what the last few years working on Dead Reckoning have revealed to you about your relationship with that rock? Like what it is about the rock that you just can't quit, no matter how arduous the process is. And you did say this was arguably the hardest one yet that you've done. Why do you keep pushing that boulder over and over? What did Dead Reckoning reveal to you about your compulsion to do that, Chris?
You don't, how do I put this? Quentin Tarantino is a very talented filmmaker. He's decided to stop making a movie after 10 films. And I believe the rationale he used was that all of his favorite filmmakers tended to they had a string of good films and then they all started to burn out. I don't believe they got less talented. I believe they ran out of confront. It is exhausting. It is absolutely demoralizing. And you want to get to a place in your career where I don't have to put up with the bullshit anymore. I get to do whatever I want. And that doesn't exist. And I know now from working for 16 years with Tom Cruise, the reason he has the career that he does, the reason he has the string of successes that he has had, the reason that his biggest movies are happening at this late stage in his career is that he never stops learning and he never stops confronting. Don't think that Tom Cruise gets up in the morning and says, yeah, I want to confront it. He gets up in the morning and knows the alternative to not confronting it is atrophy. It's death. And it ultimately comes at the audience's expense. So to the point where now when I wake up in the morning, and this happens on every movie, on a movie like Dead Reckoning Part 1 in the midst of a pandemic with all the other things that went wrong with it, you would wake up and there were days you would much rather be hit by a car and hospitalized than have to go to work. Just for some relief. I now know that when I wake up feeling that way, those are the best days. And so waking up with a feeling of dread is instantly inspiring. You push past the dread and know whatever it is I'm dreading, I'm going to find something truly unique, especially when you're surrounded by as many talented people as I'm very fortunate to be surrounded by. That's so if I've learned anything, it's, the bigger the boulder and the more miserable the task might seem, the greater work you'll produce if you confront it. Just never, ever, ever stop confronting it.
Well, Chris, this has been a joy. I must let you go, but I can't thank you enough for this conversation. I've had such a fun time chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Script Apart. Thank you so much for tuning in. A reminder that if you want to help the show continue to grow, you can join us on Patreon by visiting patreon.com/scriptapart or clicking the link in today's show notes. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.